My name's Simon Woolley, Lord Simon Woolley, and I'm your host and your chair for the next 40 minutes or so. I want to introduce our great panel for a very, very lively discussion, no holds barred. We need to talk straight. I first want to introduce Tinisha Agramonte. Can you unmute yourself and introduce yourself, where we're speaking to you from, or what organization, company you belong to?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I'm so incredibly honored and humbled to be serving on this panel with my esteemed panelists. So to you, Lord Woolley, good afternoon. I greet you from the great state of Maryland in the United States. And again, I'm the Chief Diversity Officer for Motorola Solutions, and just so incredibly excited to be here with all of you today.
Thank you very much. Can I now introduce Vijay, Raghavan?
Thank you, Lord Woolley. My name is Vijay Raghavan. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer for LexisNexis Risk Solutions Group. Been with the company for almost 19 years, and more recently I was asked to serve as the Executive Sponsor for Race and Diversity at my organization. Very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So to stateside, last but not least, Dr. Nneka Abulokwe. Correct me about my pronunciation, please.
That always happens, doesn't it?
It does.
It's a pleasure to be here, Lord Simon. And it's Nneka. I am in London with you here. So on this side of the Atlantic, it's such a pleasure to be part of this panel and discussing this really topical issue. I'm the CEO and founder of MicroMax Consulting, a boutique consulting firm that focuses on governance, tech, digital, and also a bit of diversity. I also serve as a non-executive director on boards. I provide board advisory services, but serve as a board director for Cambridge University, the Audit and Risk Committee, as well as the Davies Group. I am part of the non-executive for the board and also the chair for the Diversity and Inclusion Committee.
Thank you very much. And I see you got a color code today. You saw the memo. Black is black.
I did. We did.
We did. Well, look. Thank you for taking time out. And so we've got London and the USA, and a rich conversation to be had. I mean, look, the topic of this subject is predicated on diversity and inclusion, but that area in which we have seen, particularly in the USA, and sadly to say in the UK too, and that is the polarization of communities, of ideas, of people, and how do we acknowledge it, address it, and bring people to a shared space in which things can work a lot better. And I often think with these types of subjects, then you need honest conversations. You need to lay bare the uncomfortable truths, the elephant in the room, if you like. And then when you can confront that, then we're better placed to deal with it in an effective way. So I want to dive straight in, and Tinisha, I want to call upon you first from where you're sitting and viewing things. And what do you think are the best ways that you've found to bring opinionated and disparate people together in your workspace? How do you do that? And how do you, one, acknowledge it and then bring about that process of change?
You know, first and foremost, this is really the $1 million question, isn't it? This is something that we're all grappling with, and it's not only in our workplaces, it's in our own families, it's in our faith communities for those who subscribe to a faith. And it's something as a DEI practitioner, I've really been grappling with, especially in the US. Like, how do we bring together people who have such divergent perspectives and strong opinions, and they're so firmly planted and rooted in those perspectives? And it's really driving so many people apart. So the first thing I would tell you that I have done, that I have found to be successful, is to lead by example. That's first and foremost. And when I mean lead by example, I try to be the change that I want to see. So that means first and foremost, I recognize that these conflicts are rooted in our belief systems, our value systems. These are beliefs that we hold firmly and they're deep and they're emotional. They're not rational or logical. So when we try to have conversations of understanding with people, they end up being debates because we feel like we're being personally attacked for the ways that we were raised, the things that we were taught and we learned. So the first thing I try to do is have compassion and empathy, that we have all lived very different lives. We have vast experiences, and those experiences are rooted in our social identities, our race, our ethnicity, our national origin, our socioeconomic class, all of the things that you can think about that we differ as human beings. So I like to do something I call the CDC model. That's first find a commonality, then explore our differences, then come back to our commonalities. So I'm going to share a quick little story of where this has worked for me. I remember when I was in college, and at the time, I had only lived around Black and Brown communities, African Americans and Hispanics, working class community, raised by a single teen parent. So I'm giving you that context just so you know that was my lived experience with just that narrow perspective from those dimensions. So when I went to college, predominantly white college, I was in a sociology class. And I remember this like it was yesterday, even though this was like 30 years ago. We were having a conversation on how parents discipline their children. Now, this is something I think we can all relate to because we all have a parent-child relationship, right?
We all have an opinion, right?
And we all have an opinion. And this was on disciplining. Well, I was raised that you spank the child, right? Like you spare the rod, you spoil the child. That was rooted in my religious beliefs, my working class background, and my race, I thought all this time. So in this classroom of only white peers, I remember I didn't want to say anything because I felt like I would be the lone voice on spanking. Everyone else was like, no, use other behavior modifications. It's hurting the child. You're teaching them anger. And then all of a sudden I heard this voice say, I don't know what y'all talking about, but the way I was raised, you had to go get the switch off the tree. And I looked around and I was, who said that? Right? And it was a white woman from the South. I had not had a lot of experiences with working class whites from the South. So to hear this perspective, it was the first time that I was exposed to a broader perspective. So 2 points to this story. One is there are people out there who have different experiences and life experience, and we think we're so far apart, right? But that's because we have a narrow life view. This one helped broaden my perspective, but also even with the peers in the class who didn't see the world the way she and I did, what they did for me through their personal story, when they said, Tinisha, I remember being hit and it made me feel small. I remember thinking this is not the way to help me. It helped me see it through a humanness, right? And they didn't convince me that we shouldn't get spanked, but they definitely broadened my perspective to the point that I said, I don't have to agree with you, but I can agree to understand why we see the world differently. And I think that's a starting point.
So it is the empathy and in that other person's shoes, even if it's a short time. Vijay, I want to come to you because you're stateside, and if you was on the platform that former President Donald Trump was on, and you saw all those people out there getting angry, what would your words have been to bring them together? I know I'm putting one right on you now, because I don't think I would have seen in my lifetime, Tinisha, an assault on the Capitol as we did just after the new year. But what would you have said to try and bring that crowd together rather than get them to march on the Capitol?
Yeah, so obviously nothing that I would have said at the time of the march on the Capitol would have made a difference because that's far too late. Right? The time to have the discussion is if I had managed to get an account onto Parler and try to have a reasonable discussion with people to say, let's just let me understand your point of view and then let me express my right? And I think Tanisha's words were something that she said rung very true. You can try to operate on facts and logic. Most people think of themselves as factual and logical, but then they're operating on their own set of facts. So really, when I think about my technology organization, I have a somewhat diverse population. It could be more diverse than it is right now, but they're certainly very opinionated, and they're all convinced about their respective facts, right? So I think what's important here, to answer your question, is how do you humanize yourself so they don't think of you as an us versus them kind of entity. If you think about a good salesperson, just to use an analogy, what does a salesperson do when he or she walks into a client? Obviously, they're there to sell something based on substance. But the first thing they usually try to do is to humanize themselves with each other by looking at making an observation about the family portrait on the desk, or England's amazing performance in the cricket match against India, whatever it might be. And that's the basis to strike that kind of an emotional chord to say, look, I'm actually just like you. I'm not that different from who you are. Just like Tanisha's example of the white woman from the South.
Yeah.
There was a certain bond or commonality they were able to establish. And that was the basis to say, okay, I understand your point of view. Now hear me out. Right? That's probably the way in which I try to approach it to the extent that I can make it.
I like that idea. I like that idea, Nneka, of being able to humanize the space and make you feel like a real person, flesh and blood like them, rather than this image often that people get of us without even getting to know us. Thankfully, we've not had a march on Downing Street yet to overthrow our government. But what are your words that can confront? I mean, when people are aggressive and really want to listen, do you have any tricks that help humanize a potential conflict from polarization?
Oh, this is quite interesting, and it's deeply personal. And as long as they are human beings, we'll always find differences. But a friend of mine said to me the other day, we're talking about this, around this topic, and she said, there's more that binds us than divides us. As human beings, and our race, our gender are only skin deep. The richness we bring to the conversation or the discourse is much deeper.
Right.
And we live in a multicultural world and multicultural society.
Yeah.
I think the first step is really beginning to accept that we'll all be different, but there's value in our differences. I'll give you an example of myself in corporate life. By being a woman and a Black woman in tech, I was always different, and a lot of times it started with me not being able or feeling that confidence to speak up when I needed to. And I remember a boss of mine, and this is one of the things that has kept me in very good stead throughout my career. In my feedback on my appraisal said, Nneka should speak up more in meetings.
Right.
When she does, she's usually right. Now that was a call to action for me, and almost a light bulb moment. I mean, and that in itself, and he was a white male.
Tell me this, because this is really important to what you touched upon.
Yeah.
For people of color, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, particularly women, that describe the situation in, I would imagine, a senior space in which you were encouraged to speak out, because when you spoke, people listened.
Indeed.
Tell us, what do those watching this, how do they begin to believe in themselves that they have something to fantastically contribute? And if it isn't said, it's not heard, it's not said. How did you do that?
And this is something of a journey. It starts with and this is why I always come back to that individual, and I use myself as an example. Okay. You have to show up and know that you do have a place. You have been invited into that room. You do have a place. It's all about self-worth. It's all about confidence. And it's all about knowing that you do have value to contribute. You may look different, but that is your own inhibiting factor. Others, you see, and we often think, you see, that others may may not welcome what we have to say, but they're actually looking upon you. I mean, I serve on boards now, and I have to always remind myself that I've been brought in there as a subject matter expert who just happens to be a woman and a Black woman.
Brilliant.
So you are there in your own right.
I mean,
and
Tinisha,
we have to begin to own that.
it's owning that. Tinisha, I mean, you must be in those situations too, and do you no longer have the invariable imposter syndrome? Do you now own the space, and what does that feel like when you begin to own that space, that you're no longer apologizing for being you?
That is such an awesome question. And I want to follow up on a point that Nneka made, that it really is about a journey, right? Managing imposter syndrome. My background is that I was born to a single teen parent. I was the first in my family to graduate college and the first in my family to enter into a professional work environment. When I first came into the workplace, I felt like a fish out of water, traversing into this land of unknown, uncharted territory. And I constantly felt as if I didn't belong, as if I didn't measure up to my peers who were in those spaces. I didn't graduate from a top tier university. You know, I started in the US, what we call community college. I didn't graduate with a high GPA. So I really had low self-esteem and didn't feel like I belonged there. But I will tell you where the turning point came.
Please.
I remember talking to a colleague of mine, and this is even though I had ascended Lord Simon to the highest rank in the federal government for the US. I still dealt with imposter syndrome. I was invited to serve on a panel. And when they gave the list of prospective panelists, they all had all these letters behind their names. They had authored books. They had been on the speaking circuit on television. And I thought to myself, why do they want me? I don't deserve to be on that stage with them. And when I shared that story to my colleague, she said, Tinisha, I want you to look at me. Throughout your life, there will be a number of people who will doubt you, but you do not get to be one of those people. And so going back to Nneka's point, I had been looking at this all wrong. I had talked about all my deficits, right? Low GPA, not a high tier school, all these things I didn't know, which fork to use, glass to use, right? All these things associated with upper crust. But what I failed to remember is that I was triumphant, that I was my family's trailblazer, that I was getting into spaces that no one in my family had done before, and they were proud of me to be there. So that meant I was resilient, I was resourceful, I had demonstrated grit. And when I looked at myself that way, things changed.
How does that change the game?
It's a huge game changer because, as Nneka said, now I showed up with confidence.
Right.
I deserve to be in this space. I've earned the right to be in this space. And no one else in this room is superior to me, because the fact that I've overcome obstacles says so much about me, who I am, and the value I have.
So what you're saying is that your journey now and beating the obstacles now becomes part of your strength.
Absolutely.
I want to go to Vijay, Vijay, thank you for LexisNexis for supporting this with your company. And I would imagine us being of a non-white, let's say, that we've all had our own journeys and reached positions now where we can say we own this space. But nevertheless, you will be still in these conflict situations. How do you think that it's negatively impacting on business, this polarization of views, of ideas, of people? And how is it affecting the bottom line, and what might it be if we deal with it in a different way?
Yeah, so it absolutely impacts work and business, because even if you try to consciously separate your work life from your non-work life, the essence of social media is that one bleeds into the other. And as much as social media has its benefits, it exacerbates the issue of polarization. We've heard all the stories about echo chambers and things like that. So I'll give you an example. if you get along with a colleague at work just fine, but then you chance upon his or her Facebook feed and you realize this person absolutely believes that Bill Gates is some kind of a monster who's trying to inject microchips into people in Africa to conduct weird scientific experiments or something like that. And let's say you don't believe that Bill Gates is doing any such thing. Well, that's going to color your perception of that person. It's human nature for that to happen, right? And social media, unfortunately, perpetuates these kinds of conspiracy theories and echo chambers. And that, if you're not careful, that can tend to bleed into your working relationships with your colleagues. So in terms of how to address it, it goes back to how do you get people to relate to you better? So they see you, you humanize yourself and you humanize them. It cuts both ways, no matter how bad you think the other person is or how warped you think the other person is. And so when it comes to social media, I mean, it has its benefits. You can't unring the bell. You can't put the horse back in the barn or whatever the metaphor is. But what we can do is to get that other person to relate to you. And it often involves you telling them something about yourself. So they realize that you're more similar to them than you're different from them. What's not going to work, in my experience, is to try to bludgeon them into submission with your understanding of the facts as you know them, and try to convince them that you're being logical and that they are not.
Yes, I mean, I through this process myself, Nneka, I don't know whether you have, but I took the whole Brexit issue quite personal.
Oh, yes.
And I began to lose friends. And then I realized that I was losing friends people who I kind of liked. And I had to be able to put certain stuff in one area and our friendship in another. And that was a challenge because we've got very different ideas. And yet I needed to maintain the friendship. Have you struggled with that? Was Brexit one of those issues?
Oh gosh, Brexit is one of those issues. The vaccine is another one of those issues. But you see, Lord Simon, these are things that are very deeply entrenched in each and every one of us. And we are entitled to have our own views, and they're predicated on so many different things. Yeah. My cultural worldview. I mean, Tinisha talked about her background, which is different from my background, which informs her thinking, about these sorts of issues. I mean, we talk about Brexit. I mean, Brexit, I mean, we're at different, I mean, the people, I mean, even within regions across the UK, as you know, there was such
divide. South.
Quite. I mean, people were diametrically opposed, were on opposing sides of things. And that is fine, but the common factor there is the UK. We all live in the UK. We have to coexist regardless of these tensions. And sometimes we sometimes think, and I think this is a bit of a misnomer, where we think that we always have to have harmony in our thinking. Sometimes these diametrically opposed views create that healthy tension.
Right.
Because people have different sides of opinions as well. And this really goes down to the core of diversity. And this is when people look at diversity and think about it along the lines of racial diversity, gender diversity. But the big thing there that you cannot see is diversity of thought.
Right.
And each person has a view. I mean, Vijay touched on that. Tinisha has touched on that. You have your worldviews, but it doesn't mean that we cannot coexist in harmony.
Well, I guess there's some tensions in which you say, okay, you have these views, and I really don't want to know you and like you. And so might that be? What might there be a tipping point? And I want to ask each one of you that. But the other point is that I sit on a number of boards of Open Society Foundation, George Soros, and one of his principles is open society. I realize the principle of open society is that you accept other people's views in that open society. And sometimes it's challenging. I mean, Brexit, and I guess in the States, Tinisha and Vijay, that America was becoming so polarized and so democratic and Republican that I'm sure you're thinking, do I have friends who are on either side? Because it becomes so polarized. And so what are the principles, if you like, of that open society that allows us to say, okay, this is my red lines, but there's lots of interconnected space between. Tinisha.
I would say for me, the tipping point, and This is something that's been really hard for me to come to terms with because I have lost very close friends that I have. The polarization is so deep within my own family and within extended family and friends. And I got to the point where I said the tipping point for me is when your beliefs turn into actions, actions that may be hurtful for me and my family. That's where I have to draw the line because I respect your right to see the world the way that you do. What I do not respect is you acting in a manner that is hurtful for
Right.
other people who don't see the world the way that you see it.
Right.
And so I go back to we can have conversations all day long where we have divergent perspectives. And I love to, to the points that were made earlier, let's find that common ground. Because the reality is, no matter how divergent our perspectives are, Lord Simon, I honestly believe there's still commonality there. So the example I gave earlier about disciplining children, at the end of the day, whether you believe in spanking or you believe in some other form of discipline, we all want to raise healthy, respectful adults. That's the commonality. And I think in America right now, there's so much fear around who will be advantaged and who will be disadvantaged, depending on what we're doing. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to fairness. We just may not see that fairness and equity being achieved the same way.
I love that. Vijay.
Yeah, the question of the tipping point, it's interesting because to me, in a one-on-one discussion with my peers, by the way, I have a certain political persuasion and I have my peers who are executives who are the opposite, but we get along just fine, right? It's a difference of opinion, and we agree to disagree in many cases because at least it's a factual discussion and it's based on our worldviews. But when it comes to I kind of use this factor of racism versus ignorance. If someone is demeaning you, you can pretty much tell that they're demeaning you because they actually have this thought process that says you are inferior to them. That is a tipping point for me, right? On the other hand, many discussions are not really as stark as that. It's more ignorance, and it could be your ignorance as much as their ignorance, and that's a basis for discussion. A good example was one of my project managers in my organization found that a male colleague was talking over her, right? Now, that is an example of ignorance. He wasn't raised to be a male chauvinist, but he didn't know any better. So she called him out right there and then and said, look, I don't know if you know this, but you're talking over me, and I really would appreciate it if you didn't. He stopped. Right? So that's kind of dialogue that's useful to have in many cases.
And a lot of this is, one, being confident about yourself, but two, about leadership. And in that leadership space, Nneka, that sometimes we want to give advice and that sometimes we can get things wrong and admit that we've got things wrong. Tinisha spoke about the things that she got right. But how do we project that we're able to get things right and showcase that? But sometimes we get things wrong in a space in which often polarization doesn't allow us to admit that we can get things wrong.
This is and what I hear in this question is all about vulnerability.
Yes.
And and this is something that we think is a taboo, especially in corporate world and in a leadership position. And something, there are parallels between vulnerability and trust.
Yes.
And it also has tentacles into integrity as well, because we are fallible as human beings. Okay, and especially within a leadership way. Okay, I'm not saying that you go and you throw your toys out the pram and say, oh yes, I've got this wrong, but there are ways to show vulnerability in a leaderly way, across the organization. Right. It may be that you defer to somebody and you openly defer to somebody who knows more about that question. Right. It's even about this race discussion. We're having this discussion on race and diversity and stuff. And it's a highly sensitive topic, not so much I use myself as an example, not so much for me as a Black woman, but even more uncomfortable for the next person because they don't want to offend. They don't know how to describe you as a Afro-Caribbean or an African-American or a Black person. No, they don't know how to even label you all. Yep, okay. But you can lance that boil. And I talk about lancing that boil. You can raise that topic, and then you get past that very quickly, and then you can begin to get to the nub of issues there, or there are times when it may not necessarily be appropriate for you to ask certain questions or table certain things, and it may be better and more politically savvy for somebody else, or you to have that conversation and pass that through somebody else. But the one thing I say to you, Lord Simon, is when you don't step up, when things are being done wrong, and there are times when you have remained silent, and your silence is you're complicit.
Yes.
And that is stuff that I would say we've all fall foul on, and we need to be able to. And I think now with the growing social consciousness, Black Lives Matters, COVID, people, it's now more acceptable to then get up and challenge the status quo. You don't have to be aggressive about it. There's so many different ways.
I like the way that you do it. I like the way that you offer that in a dignified way, but a confident way, not in a shrinking violet.
No. You're not.
What's interesting is that I am a chair of the Mackenzie Dellis Packer Review, which is asking FTSE 100 business about diversity and inclusion, and we've had a great response. And I think to your point, Nneka, is that I would argue that in this last year, that big business, and I want the panel to come in on this, is it fair to say that big business in the USA and in the UK has been much more susceptible since COVID-19 and the way that it's impacted on Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities? And the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, have you noticed that big business is more susceptible to a deep dive into diversity and inclusion in a way that they would be, is this for us? Do I need to really wrestle with this? Can somebody else deal with it? Vijay, have you noticed the change, or am I being too optimistic?
No, I think you're absolutely on the money there, because I have noticed a real difference within my own organization at LexisNexis Risk Solutions Group and the parent company RELX, where the events of the past year have been kind of a catalyst. On the one hand, it's unfortunate that it took that kind of a catalyst. On the other hand, at least it's a catalyst that led to, some people, the executive team at the highest levels realizing that, we really need to take a much more proactive and a stronger stance in terms of what we do. Signing the Race at Work Charter, making sure there's funds available for all our ERGs, our resource groups, making sure that people are given unconscious bias training, all those kinds of things. Having candid conversations for people to express their feelings more openly, allyship discussions, all those things. None of those things was in place prior to last year. And the fact that all of those things have come into play over the course of the last 12 months is an encouraging sign to me.
Tinisha, stateside too with Motorola Solutions. I mean, I guess I'd like to hope that you're not the only Black woman in a senior position there. There are quite a few of you. But have you noticed a big change, a sea change in the last year in terms of moving this dial that Mackenzie Dellis Packer are very keen to do across this piece?
Yes, I've noticed a huge shift, but I do want to make one comment because I think it's very important. After George Floyd death and a number of social unrest issues that occurred in the US, we saw a lot of companies move toward hired chief diversity officers, chief inclusion, and all the things that Vijay just talked about. Yeah. It was very important for us at Motorola Solutions to make sure that we focused inwardly, because a lot of companies focused outwardly, and said what their stance was, what they planned on doing. But many in the community met that with skepticism and cynicism, right? It's like, is this just window dressing? Is this more of a PR stunt? So we started to focus inward. So first thing with them hiring me about 6 months ago, but making sure that we had a strategy that would be sustainable moving forward and making an impact, because our CEO and our senior leaders realized that we had an opportunity to do better. All companies have opportunities to do better. Right. And so I want to use this opportunity to go back to something that was said earlier, intent versus impact, right? So sometimes intent versus impact, right? Sometimes our intent does not match the impact, right? And so there are companies who have noble intentions, but the impact falls short, right? And so I think for us, we're being very deliberate and intentional about making sure that our intent aligns with the impact.
What you're
so
saying
I
is,
expect this to, oh, go ahead.
what you're saying is talk is cheap, right?
Yes.
Exactly. Is that right, Nneka? I mean, in your world, has talk been cheap, or is there something else going on?
Well, talk can be cheap, but you know something? This is a time to hold people to account. There isn't, you see, there's nowhere to hide. And I think I'm echoing just what Tinisha and Vijay have said, okay? Yes, big business has come out with big, bold statements in the wake of COVID and the George Floyd movement.
Yeah.
And it has given, you see, it has presented, let's not forget that it has presented opportunities as well, okay?
Right.
I am an independent, okay? So I work for myself, okay? And I serve on boards, and you see, I'm not trying to be provocative here, but I am not muzzled. That's not to say that those within an organization are muzzled, but they have to toe a specific corporate line, okay, within that organization. What you're finding now is that, and I will say, Lord Simon, I'm going to preface what I'll say now is that in the FTSE 100, the FTSE 250 have a long way to go in terms of the diverse mix, okay, across the table. This is the top table, okay? They're making grounds in terms of non-executive directors, but in terms of executive directors, substantive executive full-time directors at the top of the organization, I mean, in the FTSE 100, I think there's 0 in terms of black.
Zero.
You know, that is acceptable. It has to be a reflection of, yeah, it's not even BAME. We're not even talking about the BAME. We're just talking about black now. And then when you broaden that net, you know, then we have a different discussion or a different statistic. But we have to. So it's not enough for them to come out with these bold and sometimes, dare I say, platitudes, okay? Which sometimes can be patronizing. But the flip side of that argument, Lord Simon, and everybody who is listening as well, is that organizations, and this is to Tanisha's point, may not know how to do it. You see? So what the easy and the visual plastering is to hire that person who is at the intersection between you know, a black woman, you know, typical myself, a quintessential black woman, or to get somebody in to fill that seat. And what do you do about that? I mean, diversity without inclusion is you're spinning the wheels. It ain't gonna happen. You know what I'm saying? So what do you do? In order to do it and make it sustainable and meaningful, you have to go the 9 yards.
The 9 yards. And on that, Nisha, I want to, all of you really, but so we've gone forward. There is some hope. Some people are walking the walk and talking the talk and walking the walk. But in this polarization conversation, there's been pushback too. People are getting fed up with soccer players, football players taking the knee. And now they're saying Black Lives Matters, Vijay. It's somehow against the aspirations of white working class. So even this position of addressing deep-seated racial inequality is becoming polarized by some awful detractors. And how do we keep the momentum going in this space that seeks to, we come back right back to the beginning of this conversation, polarization? Tinisha and then Vijay, how do we keep it on track?
So I'm all over the place, Lord Simon, because there was so much to unpack in that statement you just made.
That's cool.
So I want to focus on one area, and I want to go back to something Nneka said earlier, and it is around the elephant in the room. I think it was Nneka. We all probably said that, the elephant in the room. When we talk about having sustainable efforts in our companies to make sure that that C-suite is representative of the rich, not only visible identity diversity, but that diversity that's below the waterline as well. I think we have to address this one thing, and this is sort of the root cause of some of the polarization. There are some people that when they hear terms diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, what they hear is reverse discrimination. What they hear is affirmative action. What they hear is we're about to lower qualification standards. What they hear is tokenism, right? And we have to acknowledge that those attitudes exist, those perceptions and those opinions. And I think we have to acknowledge it with grace too, because there is, to Vijay's point, just some ignorance. I don't think there's a willful sort of denial of systemic racism, yet people don't understand how we'll go about this in a fair and equitable way. And so I hit that elephant dead on, and I talk about that. I say what diversity and equity and inclusion really mean, and I talk about the equity piece. That equity is looking at the systemic marginalization of underrepresented groups because of historical laws and policies and the residual impact today that shows up in the numbers we see, right? But what that means is we have to look at, do root cause analysis, barrier analysis, get to the root of what's stopping someone from being represented and get full and fair consideration. And if we identify and we eliminate that, then we can move toward it. But I think you have to make sense of that to people. And I share an example of where I worked for the US Army, and we could not find C-suite level equivalent in the government, female chemical engineers. You know what it boiled down to? In the job requisition, and when they were determining who was best qualified, they were looking for candidates who had worked at an island that had been closed for 10 years. This island is where they destroyed our nation's chemical weapons, but mostly only active duty servicemen were sent there for 6 months at a time. So of course you wouldn't find qualified female chemical engineers, because they weren't on the island. As soon as we removed that, because it wasn't even a bona fide requirement, guess who floated to the top? Qualified candidates. Oh, who, by the way, happened to be female.
Well, there you go.
That's what you do.
So to getting away from this polarization that this is about men or this is about women, and seeing that because we do well, you don't do less well. It's making that conversation, and I guess Vijay, that we've got to have that wisdom of Solomon to keep all these moving places in play, rather than getting people to be tearing at each other's throats. It's a tough challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, and words, the choice of words does matter. So to me, the phrase Black Lives Matter was never controversial. Intuitively, it made perfect sense to me. Yeah. But then because I detected even in my own fairly large team of technologists that there was some diversity of interpretation as to what it meant, I felt compelled. I sent out a monthly note to my entire team. I felt compelled to draw a Venn diagram to explain what this means. Obviously, it means Black lives also matter. But the fact that some people choose to ignore that also causes them to interpret it exactly the way Tinisha described it, as some form of reverse discrimination, which is obviously not the intent. On the other hand, if you take a phrase like defund the police, President Barack Obama had something to say about that, saying that's probably a counterproductive phrase. But there are sitting congressmen and women who took exception to that and say, no, it's absolutely a non-controversial phrase. So I think there is some room for debate on what words we choose. And for a personal example, in my own organization, or in technology in general, it's not just within my organization, the likes of Google and GitHub and large organizations are looking into terms that have been taken for granted within technology, something like master slave. Right from the time I was a college kid, I've been using the term master slave to describe chips and microchips. Well, obviously that's a form of, now it's obvious to me, but back then it wasn't obvious to me that it's probably a form of microaggression to somebody who's offended by the term. Or the term blacklist, whitelist, which is meant to say that if you blacklist something, you're disallowing somebody, and whitelist means you're allowing somebody. Well, why not use the term allow list, deny list? Now, to some, that might seem like going overboard in political correctness. And it is possible to go overboard in political correctness. But there are certain things that are very stark, like master slave, that shouldn't be debatable.
Well, you know, here in the UK, and I'm sure in the USA, there's this growing movement that is called anti-woke. And, you know, these areas that we feel are a given and they're decent are being weaponized and polarized to get people excited. I mean, we're closing in about 5 minutes, but I want to give you a couple of minutes each to kind of sum up about where you see these great challenges are. But to pivot to, when we get it right, what does it mean for all of us? Nneka, I want to come to you first. I mean, that you're running your own business, you sit on boards, you have to gravitate in these, often you're the minority in these spaces, and yet you need to own it. That how do you, what is some of the last words that you want to say that make sense of the challenges that we've spoken about?
You know, I talk about, when you say, how do you make this work, or the benefits of it all, I mean, that's what I extrapolate from what you're saying, is social cohesion.
Right.
You know, I mean, there is that, I mean, you see, we have to coexist in a society that is accepting of all. You see, we talk, I mean, and just to go back to this Black Lives Matter, I mean, Black Lives Matter really sort of came to the fore, the backdrop of George Floyd. So you have to look at it within context, okay? And the backdrop of the social inequality, okay? But I'm a firm believer in all lives matter as well. But this was just highlighting the social inequalities to a particular population group, okay? I say to organizations that I serve on their boards that the moment you begin to marginalize any population group, you're doing yourself a disservice.
Right. I love that.
Yeah. So, and this is when I talk about being even-handed or and say more equitable, looking for a more equitable society, then surely there is good and good for all of us. There's a common good as well. So it's going back to that common ground discussion again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nneka. Vijay, your last words on, we've got a big audience, we've got a global audience out there, and they're looking to you. They want answers around how they bring people together from this polarization. The floor is yours.
Well, so I was an immigrant to the United States 30 years ago, and I see myself as a beneficiary of good diversity and inclusion practices. Maybe inadvertently, I just happened to get thrown in with a lot that were able to look past my strange accent, my somewhat strange behaviors as a new immigrant, and they were able to look purely at my skills, my ability, and my work ethic, and give me chances to succeed. So now that I'm in the position that I'm at, the least I can do is to pay it forward. So that's really my word of advice to all the people who've risen through the ranks. No matter what their background is, no matter what their ethnicity is, you owe it to yourself to pay it forward.
I love that. I love that. Tinisha, you're getting less but one word.
Humility and grace. It starts with me. This is such a huge undertaking. Each of us needs to figure out how we can start with ourselves. And I say, give people grace. They may say it the wrong way. They may not know the right way to say it. Give them grace. Start from a place of good intentions. And then finally, humility. Sometimes we have to accept, as Vijay said, that maybe the wording is not right. And maybe people who see the world differently than we do, they have some valid points. Acknowledge those points without feeling like it somehow diminishes your own perspective.
I love that. Nneka, we should have Tinisha and Vijay here in the UK.
We should. You see, you're reading my mind now, Lord Simon.
I'm going to speak to Layla McKenzie. Layla McKenzie has put us all together, and there's a global conversation. She's a superstar in her own right, and I'm very, very honored to be supporting her and getting the FTSE 500 into shape. It's what she wants to do. And this has been part of that great conversation. Tinisha, with humility, Nneka, with wisdom, and Vijay, with insight and passion. That's what this conversation has been about this last 15 minutes or so. And I just hope that it excites our viewers, that they can believe in themselves to be transformative. play that role, to own that leadership space, and we inform, we inspire. You know what I found listening to all today is that you have this ability to inform, to inspire, but to move people.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Nneka, you spoke about that it's emotional.
It is.
That these things are, you get an emotional response, and I think that you've done that today. So thank you all very much. I hope the lockdown we can all meet in London or Washington DC, or we can meet together, because that would make it so much more richer. So thank you all.
Thank you.